Mark Satin grew up in Texas and migrated to Canada to dodge the draft during the Vietnam War. He was a key leader in the Toronto Anti-Draft Program, an organization that helped draft dodgers integrate into Canada. He also wrote the Manual for Draft-Age Immigrants, a book that instructed draft dodgers on how to migrate to Canada and find housing and jobs upon arrival. The book sold at least 100,000 copies. Satin migrated back to the U.S. after President Jimmy Carter pardoned the draft dodgers in 1977. He now lives in Oakland, California, where he shared the stories of his time in Canada.
I couldn't stand being in school anymore. I wasn't learning anything. I was running a SDS chapter, Students for a Democratic Society. I actually managed to get myself into the presidency, and I was having a lot of fun, but it wasn't going anywhere. I was just being a radical on campus. There was no reason to be on campus. I didn't care about what they were teaching me. I cared about civil rights and I cared about stopping the war. My draft board was in Texas. They were very, very pro-war in Texas. I loathed everything about the war, and I loathed the selective service system and didn't trust them and didn't want to deal with them. So I wouldn't even take my physical. Now that was unbelievably foolish. As it turns out, there were physical ailments that I had. I'm not sure they'd have taken me under those circumstances. And I don't think anyone would have wanted me in a foxhole. To not even try to get out of it by taking my pre-induction physical was unbelievably foolish and even self-sabotaging, because I loved my country and didn't want to have to leave it. The vast majority of American kids my age were not drafted, by the way. Most of us were able to get out of it for one reason or another. The further up you went in the scale of middle class, upper class, upper class, the easier it was to get out of it, simply because there were more counselors and there was better information. I was not an upper class person. I mean, my father was a school teacher. We lived like everybody else. I felt it was incumbent on me, if I didn't want to fight, to do something that would be a protest against the war. And I felt that going to Canada, unlike many people on the left who felt that draft dodging to Canada was running away, I felt just the opposite. I felt that if we could publicize ourselves somehow, if 10, 20, 30,000 Americans were saying no to their country and giving up their lives in the US by going to Canada or wherever, it would be a powerful message to Americans that something wasn't right with the war, and it would force them to begin to think about what they were doing in Vietnam. Because, I mean, in those days, without social media, without even cable TV, people were much, much less involved in what's going on in the world. Many people, it didn't even register with them. Even with young people who faced the draft, it didn't register on many of them what was really going on. I have to say, I was very unsympathetic to guys that went into the Army, even if they didn't realize what was going on, until I ran the hostel in Vancouver and met a lot of these deserters. They didn't know. They didn't know that going into the Army meant that they would soon be trying to kill people in Vietnam. It was, believe it or not, it just hadn't gotten through their heads. But it was wonderful counseling draft dodgers, just on a personal level, not only because I was able to do something against the war, i.e. help Americans come to Canada and then publicize the fact that they were coming. But I was able to meet people who were like me. You have to realize that in Moorhead, Minnesota, and Wichita Falls, Texas, where I grew up, there were very, very few people like me. And unfortunately, this was the 60s. In those days, men did not talk about intimate stuff with each other. So even though there may have been people in my classes who felt the same ways I did about the war and about the civil rights movement, virtually none of us talked about this stuff. We talked about sport and girls. This was how men talked in the 60s. And as a result, many of these guys, when they came up to Canada, had nobody to talk to about what they were thinking and feeling. It's a remarkable situation. It's hard even to recreate that situation today, because since the feminist movement and the various men's movements and just the country moving on spiritually since the 60s, people do talk about important things with each other much more than they did then. So it was love at first sight with these guys. So many of them had gone through what I'd gone through. So not only was I counseling them, but I was relating to them as a human being. And some of these counseling sessions would go on and on for hours. This is ultimately why I wrote the manual. Once I managed to get us into the press, there were so many kids coming that I just didn't have time to spend. I didn't have an hour to spend with each of them as they came into the office. So I needed to create a manual that was detailed enough to give them the basic information they needed so that they didn't have to rely on an hour and a half conversation with me to know how to immigrate and or how to adjust to the job situation, in the housing situation, and the where can you find girlfriends, where can you find places to work against the war, all this stuff, intimate stuff, that you need to tell people when they first arrive. So that's why we needed a 100-page long book. The address of the hostel was 1065 West 8th Avenue. And Larry Martin's hostel, he took over my hostel afterwards. He was kicked out of the hostel because, he, at least his story to me, is that the police decided that there were too many beds for 2 bathrooms. We managed to stuff 30 beds in there, and there was also sleeping space enough for 20 more sleeping bags. So we managed to get, I think the most we ever got in there was 49. Anyway, somehow the Canadian police found, got in there one day and saw there were only 2 bathrooms. As soon as the New York Times magazine story hit, we became a public phenomenon. People were even more dependent on the Times then than they are now. Um, every media company that cared about the story, that cared about public issues, was reading the Times. So within a few weeks of that story appearing, we were getting visits from major magazines and major newspapers all across the country, all across the world, really. The manual got itself into the New York Review of Books. I mean, within a few months of that article appearing, we were big news. And the counseling office was in Toronto. And even though there were excellent counseling offices in Montreal and Vancouver, and kids did go there, um, we got more than any of them put together, probably. Also, we became well known for being able to put people up and help people, in ways that were fairly unusual. We had a We'd set up a job service that was very competent. So guys who came up without many skills were able to get hired right away. I mean, they were virtually all, I mean, they were all over 18, and they'd all had some skills. I mean, in those days, you'd work when you were in high school, or you'd, these were middle class kids. Many of them worked when they were in college. And as you may have noticed in the manual, most of the older ones also have the list of occupations in national demand. That was the most important part of the manual, because it gave kids, even who didn't have much job skills, that if they came up, they'd be able to claim that they had a skill at something. This list was not publicly available, but it was given to us by our secret supporter at the Department of Immigration, and we published it. So all of the people we helped and all of the people who read the manual were able to see what they could claim at the border to make them a valuable Canadian. I mean, it's amazing the menial stuff that Canada was looking for in the late 60s and early 70s. Anyway, I think the manual gave us a sense of credibility. Also, the fact that the first two editions, anyway, were published by the House of Anansi, which is a reputable Canadian publisher, also gave the manual a dollop of credibility that the leaflets handed out by the other draft counseling groups in Canada did not have. And that was especially useful for middle class kids coming not from the political centers of New York City and San Francisco or from the hot political campuses like Michigan and Wisconsin and Berkeley and Columbia, but kids coming from the kinds of places I went to, State University of New York or Midwestern State University or University of Illinois, kids who weren't really part of the movement left, but just wanted to do something other than kill people in Vietnam or go to jail or live underground. Oh, that's the other thing the left wanted us to do, live underground, get a fake name and live on the lam until hopefully you get amnesty someday. I actually did that. I did that for 7 months. I'd gotten bored with Canada. I don't know if you can relate to that. I got bored with Canada and I really wanted to be with some friends in Oregon. So I got the name of a guy who died. I I went to a cemetery and found the name of a guy who died, who was born about when I was and died at the age of 6 or 7 months. And I looked him up in the death records in the newspaper and got his mother's name and wrote away for his birth certificate. In those days, this stuff wasn't computerized. It actually
Mm.
was computerized, but the computers were old and huge, and they weren't all connected to each other yet. So for 7 months of my life, I was Frederick William Wiley. And I was a Teamster as Fred Wiley. I actually had a Teamster card. There were very, very few people that came through our group that just wanted to not have to serve in the Army. Many of us, like I did, were perfectly willing to be drafted. They just didn't want to be drafted to kill people for no good reason. You know, I told several reporters then that I would be happy to serve in the Army if it meant that I would be protecting the United States, genuinely protecting it, or if it meant that I could be doing work at home, protecting our borders, or teaching people life skills as if I knew any myself, life skills, or helping with literacy. There was a lot of illiteracy in the South still then, as I knew firsthand. Um, I'd have been happy to do that. I think a government has every right, especially if it's a prosperous, successful government. I then thought, and still do, a government has the right to 2 years of your life, but should give you a choice as to how you could serve it. I actually, once I got my law degree and passed the bar, I volunteered for the Army myself in 1999. I was rejected. I'm sure they took one look at my social media or whatever it was, the Wikipedia, whatever, and thought, no, not him. One of the reasons I left Canada is I didn't want becoming a draft dodger to be a central part of my life, even though America's full of blowhards and mean people and exasperating stuff. Um, in the United States, I thought I would be I would be able to make more of a difference ultimately. as a human being, writing books and doing newsletters and ultimately traveling the country and trying to set up organizations than I'd be able to do in Canada. I just didn't, I mean, like a marriage, I just didn't think it was the right fit, even though I'm so grateful for the place to giving me sanctuary for 11 years. Everyone who I was responsible to in the draft program thought I was arrogant as hell. Actually, I'm a sweet person. I'm a mild-mannered guy. But to a Canadian, I'm just ambitious beyond all get out. When I came up in 67, vast majority of Americans were against the war. But by the end of the 60s, especially after the Tet Offensive, most Americans felt ambivalent about the war. And even today, I mean, even on the right, so far as I can tell, a lot of people understand that fighting in Vietnam was not in our long-term interest. I mean, the place went to war with China like 5 years after they kicked the Americans out. I mean, how hostile should the Vietnamese have ever been? When I was trying to find a job and I just graduated from law school, I really wanted to work for a year or two for a large firm in New York. I thought it would be a really good move for me. Large firms, as soon as I found out that I'd been to Canada and why, absolutely were not interested in me. What would their fancy clients think when they looked me up and realized that my background involved writing the notorious manual for draft dodgers when I was a draft counselor in Canada and wanted for 20 years for draft dodging? That was the charge, by the way. It was 20 years for me. They gave me the full 10 years for failing to show up for induction and another 10 years for failing to show up for my physical. The FBI showed up for several Christmases. This is how clueless they were. They didn't even realize I was Jewish. They showed up for several Christmases outside my parents' house in Wichita Falls and then in Texas. And once my mom went out and and gave them hot chocolate, they were sitting there like with their crew cuts in the car, waiting for me to come home so they could nab me, you see. So she came out and gave them hot chocolate. And one of them said, we'd like you to see the file that we have on your boy. And they pulled this thing out. And my mom says it was 8 inches long. I suspect that was somewhat of an exaggeration, but it was probably thick enough to send a shiver of fear and horror. I mean, it was so awful. I mean, she went through such drama and conniptions. I finally got amnesty and I visited my house, and she was driving me back to the bus station, weeping, literally weeping, because I was making such a mess of myself, mess of my life. The people that came through the hostel were different than the ones that came to me in Toronto to get counseled. Um, the they were much. First of all, about half of them were deserters. I wasn't counseling the deserters in Toronto except for a couple. But the hostel, they were almost half, at least a third, were deserters. Some had deserted and out of Vietnam and just managed to find their way back to the States. Um, some deserted when they were first assigned to Vietnam, and some, after their first tour of duty, decided that they didn't want to kill any more people, and they came to Canada. And the Vancouver counseling group mostly kept the straight middle class kids for themselves and sent them to other people in Vancouver. But they sent all of the deserters to us, and they sent many of their difficult cases to us. That is, kids who weren't that well adjusted. Plus, we were getting a lot of middle-class kids who just heard about the hostel and came up and stayed in the hostel either right after they immigrated or while they were in the process of immigrating, because at that time you could immigrate from within Canada as well as from without. So there was a culture clash in the hostel that was fascinating. On the whole, the people in the hostel were much more dependent um, than the people who were coming through Toronto, especially the deserters. The deserters many of them were in terrible emotional shape. Of course, they'd had no one to talk to about their feelings when they were in the army. And when they came here, some of them were virtually silent. Um, some of this is sort of mumbled. Fortunately, they had each other and they began to meet one another. Sometimes the deserters were so out of it that we had to get rid of some of them. One of them, for instance, was so wired that he was woken up by accident once, and he immediately leapt up in his karate crouch, ready to kill the person who'd woken him. And we just couldn't handle that. I mean, he was too dangerous. If someone bumped the bed the wrong way, he might have actually done damage. So we had to ask him to leave. Actually, he left on his own. And then the middle class kids were kind of different. They were really enjoying being in Vancouver, free of the draft, and they would bring women home, and the deserters were not very socially adept, and they would glare at that, and there was a lot of tension in the household. One wonderful thing about this house, um, I found it. I just been in Vancouver for a couple days, and I decided, and I met a girl named Karen at Melanie's house, and we decided that we wanted to run a hostel. So I wandered through Kitsilano, and I found this. This gives you a sense of how different the 60s was. There was this marvelous house. It was huge. It was painted army green, ironically enough. And there were two guys sitting in front who looked kind of weird. And I asked them what was going on. Was the house for rent? And they said they wanted to get out of their lease. Did I want to rent it? So there was this enormous house. It had like a bunch of bedrooms upstairs, a full basement, and their lease was $75 a month. So that's how Vancouver's first hostel happened. We were really welcomed by everyone. Canadians were not necessarily against the war, but they were also, even in 67, 68, very non-judgmental toward us. Even those who supported the war felt some empathy for us. And Vancouver was full of people who were putting guys up. Toronto, within a few months, I had a list of literally 200 Torontonians who were housing us. That's remarkable. They were coming to me. All I'd done is get myself into the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail a couple times, and people were constantly calling the office asking if they could help. These weren't necessarily people on the left. Many of them were simply people who had empathy for a situation. That is so healthy. I hope that aspect of Canada has not changed and will never change.